Hello, and welcome to this week's recorded service from the Ipswich Methodist Circuit. My name is Steve Mann. I am Superintendent Minister of the circuit, and I look after the churches at the southern end of the circuit: Elmset, Bramford, Capel, Holbrook, and Chelmerdiston. And whoever you are, whenever and wherever you're watching this, you're very, very welcome. This week is part three, or in the lectionary, of a whistle-stop tour through the book of Job. 2 weeks ago, we saw the beginning of Job's story as God allows Satan to test Job. Satan comes to God and says, well, Job may look very righteous, but if you just let me rough him up a bit, then we'll see the truth of it. And God allows it. Now, I want to say from the outset that I do not see this as a literal story, largely because it doesn't in any way equate to the God that I know. My theology of God, my experience of God points in a completely different direction, and not a God who would allow the kind of suffering that comes to Job. And remember that 10 of his children are killed for no reason other than to test him, that all of his livestock is snatched, taken by raiders, that a terrible skin condition afflicts him. This is not the God that I know and believe in. Instead, I see this as a kind of what if story, a story that is set up in order for the discussion that comes afterwards, a discussion that we're still having thousands of years later about suffering and where it comes from, specifically as to whether suffering is something that is caused by our sin or the sin of people close to us. And that's the discussion that Job and his friends go on to have in the ensuing chapters. But the lectionary doesn't take us into that world. Instead, last week and this week, we look at the interchanges between Job and God. Last week, Job was maybe echoing so many of us when he was saying that God feels so distant from him and he wants to plead his case to God. This is what Job said. Today also my complaint is bitter. His hand is heavy despite my groaning. Oh, that I knew where I might find him, that I might come even to his dwelling. I would lay my case before him and fill my mouth with arguments. Job didn't get an immediate response from God, but this week we do see God's response. And immediately we see that the tables have been turned. Job had said that he wanted to lay his case before God and to hear God's answer, but suddenly it's Job himself who finds himself under the spotlight. I will question you, says God, and you shall declare to me. We all love a good pot down, don't we? There's a supposed exchange between Winston Churchill and Lady Esther that's often brought up when famous put downs are being discussed. I say supposed because the words allegedly used are, according to the internet at least, first seen in a magazine article that predates the date that this exchange was supposed to have happened by some years. But let's not spoil a good story. Lady Esther tells Churchill that she's so appalled by him that if he were her husband, she would poison his drink. To which Churchill replies that if he were indeed her husband, he would gladly drink that drink. Now, that may be a pretty good pot down, but as pot downs go, they don't come much greater than the one that God uses on Job. Where were you? Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me, if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Can you lift up your voice to the clouds so that a flood of waters may cover you? Who is it who's put wisdom in the inward parts or given understanding to the mind? And so God goes on and on. Tell me, Job, he says, the answer to all these questions. Is it you who can do all these things? Or is it me? Ouch. Or to quote a more modern expression, Job, you've just been burned. Likewise, this week we've seen history made in the world of Tetris. And if you need educating or reminding, Tetris is a video game that dates from the mid 1980s and which has remained popular ever since then. This week, for the first ever time, and I say the first ever time in nearly 40 years of trying, someone has actually got to the end of it, has got through all the levels so that it's looped all the way back to the beginning. Now, that made the news. It was in terms of events happening this week, and that is arguable, I guess, quite a human achievement. But let's be honest, who will be remembering that or celebrating that in 100 years' time or more? Our human achievements may seem pretty big, but they pale in significance compared to other human beings, and even more so in terms of what God has done and can do. So, is God simply saying to Job in these words that we're reflecting on today, is God simply saying, Job, shut up? You don't know what you're talking about, and that's simply an end to it. No, I think there's more to it than that. And I just want us for a little while to take a step back and look at the detail of what God says to Job. And what God says to Job falls into two sections. There is what we might call the macro and the micro, the big picture and the fine detail. First of all, we see in our reading the big picture. God has created a wonderful world of precision and diversity and given us wisdom and understanding to live in it, to manage it, to be aware of what's going on around us. Every glorious element of that world is in its allotted space and everything works together under God's direction. That's the big picture. And then there is the fine detail. God is all over the big picture, but also reveals himself to be there in the smaller things, providing for us in the small and the personal things of day-to-day life. Can you, he says to Job, can you hunt the prey for the lion or satisfy the appetite of the young lions? Who provides for the raven its prey? God here is pictured as being intimately and directly involved with his creation. Back in July, when I was recording the service for whatever Sunday it was at that point, we were reflecting upon Abraham, and Abraham being asked seemingly to sacrifice his son Isaac. And I commented then that I believe that the reason that Abraham went through with going off on the journey that he'd been told would lead to the sacrifice, the only reason that he did it was that he trusted in God's promises to him. The fact that God had promised that he would have many descendants and that he would have them through Isaac. And that because of that, even though he may not have understood why he was being asked to go off on this journey to the place of sacrifice, nevertheless, he knew that it would not end in the death of Isaac because he trusted in God's nature and God's promise. Now, as we come to the end of this sermon, you may feel like Job right now. You may feel that God is very distant and you don't like it. No one likes it when they're in that situation. You may be experiencing things in your life that you wish weren't there, and you can't understand. You can't understand why God would allow these things to remain and be there. Now, I can't speak for God, none of us can. But I can say in these verses, we see a God who really is there with us, both in the big picture and in the fine detail, when we can see it and when we can't. He is a God who loves us and provides for us. I'm sure of that. And whose nature and promises will not change. He is the same God yesterday, today, and forever. And I pray that whatever you're feeling at the moment, you may have the strength to go on trusting, even if it's just by the edge of your fingertips, that you may have the strength to go on trusting in that reality. Even as I say, if you're not feeling it right now, until that time when once again you can see more clearly.